All right, so first off, I just want to welcome everyone to StatTech Research's seminar on measuring progress and well-being. For those of you who don't know me, I am Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers at StatTech Research, the research division of StatTech, the official statistics and economic studies institute of Luxembourg. Our other organizers, Chiara Peroni and Francesco Saracino, are also online. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Saamah Abdallah, who will discuss the Happy Planet Index. But before introducing Saamah, I'd like to say a few words about the seminar series and its organization. First, we are recording today's event, which we will make available online for future reference. Indeed, we just posted Nuno Nunes' recent talk on local well-being indicators in Portugal, so that's now available on the website. Also on the website, you can see our upcoming talks. We have Julia Slater and Anka Planknol scheduled for November and December. As for organization today, we have 1 hour. Of which the last 25 minutes or so will be reserved for questions and answers. At that time, you can raise your virtual hands or write in the chat box. You may, of course, use the chat box at any time. However, we hope that you keep all of your substantive questions to the end. We'll only address kind of the most burning clarifying questions in the middle. And lastly, please keep your microphones muted to reduce any sort of background noise. And now to welcome Saamah Abdallah. Salma Abdallah is a globally recognized expert in well-being measurement and policy, having won the Community Indicators Consortium Award in 2016 as an emerging leader in the field of community conditions and well-being. Salma has conducted complex analysis for a range of clients, including Eurostat, the Big Lottery Fund, the European Network Against Racism, RAND Corporation, and Eurofund. He has also served on multiple advisory boards, including the UK's Office of National Statistics, the OECD, and Eurostat. His extensive experience is actually quite difficult to quantify, so I'll say one last thing. Today he speaks about the well-known Happy Planet Index, and that has been, and he's been a lead developer since its inception in 2006. So without further ado, Saamah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kelsey. I'm very happy to be with you all today. Just a little bit about why I'm here. So when we were preparing the latest Happy Planet Index, we approached Francesco to write a little sort of expert opinion section on Luxembourg and Italy for the website, and he said yes, he'll do it, but in return, could I do a presentation for the seminar series? I think actually, to be honest, given the opportunity to do this presentation is actually a favor for me as well. So I probably still owe you a couple of favors, Francesco. So thank you very much for inviting me here. So this is all very fresh. We just launched the Happy Planet Index literally 2 days ago on Monday. So you are this is the first presentation that I'm doing aside from the launch event. So the second presentation ever. So it's interesting to talk about. I'm looking forward to getting people's input and reflections. Yeah, well, I hope you'll find it interesting. And so I'll just give you a little bit of an outline of what I'm going to cover today. So as we've got a little bit of time, I'll just give you a little bit of background on the origins of the Happy Planet Index, why we developed it. I'll tell you about the approach we've used for calculating it. I'll obviously tell you the results from the latest Happy Planet Index. And I'll spend a little bit of time reflecting on implications specifically for national statistics offices. I'll say now at the top that I guess national statistics offices weren't the primary audience when we developed the Happy Planet Index. We were more interested in sort of trying to influence political actors and civil society in general. And there are other things that we did when we were at the New Economics Foundation, which is where the idea was incubated. There were other things that we developed which were more specifically aimed for statistics offices. And so I'll talk a little bit about those at the end as well to kind of give a bit of a context and sort of a rounder perspective. So the Happy Planet Index was developed in 2006, and I just want to sort of situate sort of where we were in 2006. It's only 15 years ago, but it's a sort of a huge era change in terms of the issues of measuring progress and well-being. So in 2006, that was before the Beyond GDP conference that the European Commission organized in 2007. It was before the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission was set up. It was before, for example, Eurostat began measuring well-being, and that led to implications across the European Union. I was, as Kelsey said, I was involved with Eurostat's development of work on measuring well-being, which means I've been to Luxembourg countless times. So that was definitely an interesting part of my work in well-being. So it's before all these national initiatives. I think at the time when we developed it, I think Australia was doing something interesting. I think that was it in 2006. Oh yeah, and Bhutan was talking about gross national happiness, but they hadn't actually started measuring it yet. So, but there were, of course, people out there who were trying to critique GDP, which I guess is the main motivation for developing the Planet Index, to provide an alternative so that we don't always focus on GDP as the key measure of progress. Now, there were lots of measures, environmental measures. This image, this is actually from 2006, so it's just before the Planet Index was released, the Environmental Performance Index, and that included lots of different indicators. And there were lots of measures, well, maybe less so, but there were still measures of living conditions, quality of life, and actually things that started to refer to well-being. And this is a report which I think, I would say inspired a lot of the work that we did at the beginning of our work on well-being. And there were initiatives which did bring them together to some extent. So this is just one example from the Netherlands. This is the Sustainable Society Index. Actually, well, it says 2008, but it was developed before then, which included measures of, various things which include well-being and environmental impact, societal measures in general, and tried to put them all together. But I would say that our feeling, and definitely my colleague who came up with the idea of the Planet Index, his feeling at the beginning was definitely that this is too complicated. There are too many indicators. It's hard to kind of form none of these initiatives really seem to be cutting through. I guess the most successful alternative indicator initiative at that point was the Human Development Index. Obviously, it had the UN behind it, so that gave it a lot of traction. And it was relatively simple. It had 3 indicators, and so there was this sense that most of these initiatives are not achieving much traction because they're just too complicated. It's hard to really understand what the numbers mean at the end. So I guess that was the motivation for some of the earlier work that Nick Marks and colleagues did on measuring, on trying to create a redefine progress. I imagine a lot of you are familiar with the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, or Genuine Progress Indicator, as it's sometimes called, or Measure of Domestic Progress. It has many different names. I can't remember there's another name in Germany as well for it. But this was an adjusted GDP measure, which has been calculated in different forms in different countries. And my colleague Nick Marks was working on that from 1994. And that had the advantage of bringing things together into a single number, which you could kind of communicate. You could say this is an adjusted GDP, which, in terms of communication is quite powerful, allows you to draw nice graphs like this and show that GDP is growing, but the MDP is relatively stagnant. But it's hard to really, when you actually start calculating these indicators, and I worked calculating the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare for several years, you begin to realize they're a bit dodgy because they have a lot of different assumptions that you have to make in terms of, okay, well, how much do you value a life? How much do you value, saving 10 minutes commuting time? All these things. And there's a lot of assumptions that you have to make. And we did a lot of sensitivity analyses. And when you do them, you get completely different results depending on how you do them, how you calculate it. And at the end of the day, in terms of trying to create a different narrative about what progress means, they only take you so far, because they're arguing that GDP doesn't capture everything, and therefore if we just capture those things we can adjust GDP. But they still basically give you a value in terms of euros or pounds or dollars or whatever it is. They still make you think that basically it's about money, and all else being equal, if you can keep pollution the same and you keep, household labor the same, then ultimately GDP is a good thing. And that was a narrative that we wanted to challenge. So the Planet Index basically is a very simple idea. It basically says, okay, well, let's take the most important output in terms of our society. What do we really want? Well-being. And let's take the most important important input, and that's environmental resources. That's the finite resources that we have to work with. As opposed to, for example, economists often talk about labor productivity as if we need to minimize the amount of labor we use. We're saying, well, no, we don't need to minimize the amount of labor we use in our societies. We need to minimize the amount of resources we use. And And it says, well, okay, let's measure just those two things, and all the other things that are important, health system, economy, etc. They're all important, but they're just mediators. They're means to the end. The economy is just one of them, but there are many others, governance structures, etc. And those all things are things that should be measured. But if we want to try and create a headline indicator which kind of gives us the overall message of how well we're doing, then let's not measure them for that purpose. So that's basically what we tried to do with the Happy Planet Index. So we came down to having three components, and they were life expectancy, which in this case, in the latest report, we use well, actually for all reports, we've used the Human Development Report data for that. And then experienced well-being, subjective well-being here. And for the last three Happy Planet Index reports, we've used Gallup World Poll data because that's available across the world. In the first Happy Planet Index in 2006, we had to do a lot of heroic harmonizing of data because there was data on well-being from different surveys, but there was Eurobarometer, there was the Latino Barometer, there was the World Value Survey, and we had to try and somehow fit them all together and then estimate well-being for lots of countries. We have the luxury of not. We can afford to be a bit more strict now, and we just use data which is calculated using the Gallup World Poll. And actually, we've been able to do that for the last 4 editions. Sorry. One thing that that we're less than happy about with that is that the Gallup World Poll focuses on a question which is called the ladder of life, which asks people. Sorry, I should have put the question in here. It asks people. Imagine a ladder where 0 is the worst possible life and 10 is the best possible life. Where do you put yourself on this ladder? That's the question they use for to measure experienced well-being in the Gallup World Poll. We would prefer a question, the life satisfaction question, which is used across Europe, which is used in the UK, which is recommended by the OECD, but for some reason hasn't had so much traction in the USA. But that's the question we prefer to use, but unfortunately we don't have that. We have the ladder of life. And then basically, so we take those two things, we multiply them together. Sorry, I'll just say we multiply those two together to create something like happiness adjusted life years. This is an idea that we took from Ruth Veenhoven. He was the first person to do that calculation. We noticed that this year, Richard Layard and colleagues in their World Happiness Report have also calculated something similar to this. And given it a different name, but anyway, so it's a method which we've seen other people using as well, multiplying those two together, similar to disability adjusted life years. So the happiness adjusted life years, and then we divide that by the ecological footprint. So the ecological footprint comes from the Global Footprint Network. They've been calculating it since I think 2005 was the first time they did it, or 2004, and every few years they update that. They produce a new report. Which they call national accounts of national footprint and biocapacity accounts, and they calculate the ecological footprint and biocapacity for every country around the world, well, as many countries as possible. We've used the data that came out this year in 2021, but actually it's important to note that that data only goes up to 2017. So we then had to do some estimates to get the last 3 years of our data set for 2018, 2019, and 2020. And to do those estimates, I'll talk about 2020 later, it's a bit complicated, but for 2018 and 2019, we've used data on national level CO2 emissions. So the ecological footprint is basically a measure of the amount of land that is required to sustain the lifestyles of people within a country. And that includes land that is to sequester carbon emissions. So the main thing that goes into the ecological footprint is CO2 emissions. But it also includes land required for food production, so that's for fisheries and for timber. So it also includes grazing and crops, and also the built environment. So as I say, it includes lots of things, which we like because it means that we're not just focusing on carbon emissions, but it is fair to say that the main factor that drives the ecological footprint is CO2 emissions. So effectively, the Happy Planet Index, when you do that, when you create this happy life years at the top and you divide it by ecological footprint, effectively what you've got there is an efficiency measure. How much well-being do you get per unit of environmental resource use? And as we've said many times, the Happy Planet Index does not tell you which is the happiest country in the world. It tells you which country is the most efficient or most sustainable at achieving that well-being. And I think that's why we end up with results which perhaps surprise people, and which turn conventional ideas about what a good society looks like on their head. But of course, we'll come to that. We'll come to that later. So just and in terms of how we bring it together, you'll notice, I imagine many of you are statisticians, so you'll notice that this is not an equal sign, but a approximately sign. That's because we do a couple of adjustments to the components before we bring them together. And the reason we do that is because each variable holds a different amount of variance. So life expectancy, for example, varies between, I can't remember exactly now, but probably I think about between 65 years or 50 or 65 years in the lowest life expectancy countries to 80 years. So that's kind of a factor of, between 65 and 80, that's a factor of maybe 30%. Whereas ecological footprint varies from 0.5 global hectares per capita in Yemen to 15 global hectares per capita in Qatar. So it's a factor of 30, multiplication of 30 there. Now, that variation may be meaningful, but so the difference between the amounts of variation may be meaningful, but we've chosen because we don't want to be accused of focusing too. Basically, if we didn't do any adjustments, then the ecological footprint would dominate the Happy Planet Index, and you'd basically get that the countries with the highest Happy Planet Index would be the countries with the lowest ecological footprints. And we felt that this was not going to be a very helpful communication, a very helpful message. So we've equivalized the variances for each variable. And to do that, because we can't have zero, so we can't do the standardization where you just subtract the mean, and divide by standard deviation, because we can't do that, because that will produce zeros, and you can't divide by zero, obviously. We use a method where we add or subtract a constant to each variable, so that the variance is the same. The coefficient of variance is the same. And then we calibrate it such that a score of 100, HPI score of 100 would be achieved with a life expectancy of 85 years, well-being of 10 out of 10, and an ecological footprint of 1.56 global hectares in 2019. And that number wasn't taken out of the hat. That number is the basically if everyone used 1.56 global hectares of land around the world, then we would theoretically be living within our limits according to the ecological footprint metrics. So that's the biocapacity which exists on the planet per person. So we've used that as our way to kind of calibrate the score. Because biocapacity changes with per year, basically because of increasing population, that varies from year to year. So in 2019, it's 1.56. I think at the beginning of the time series, it's more like 1.9 or something like that in 2006. And then you have this actually quite complicated formula, which is actually used to calculate the HPI. So that's how we do it. Now I'll tell you what the results look like. And as I say, we're focusing on I haven't said this very explicitly yet, but we focused on 2019 when we've been reporting the results. We have calculated data for 2020, but I'll come on to that later. We're focused on 2019, and we've got a time series going back to 2006, but I'll talk about the 2019 data first. To do that, I'm going to have to switch to the website. So I find it's helpful to break it down component by component when I'm presenting the results for the Happy Planet Index, so you get a sense of how it all builds up together. So first of all, life expectancy, which I guess is kind of a fairly familiar pattern. Perhaps it's the best known indicator of the three indicators we've used. And you can see, sort of unsurprisingly, that wealthier countries come out in green, and poorer sub-Saharan Africa countries come out in red. The thresholds here are fairly arbitrary, what's green, yellow, red, but I think they give you a picture of what countries are doing well and which countries aren't. But they perhaps hide some of the things which are quite interesting. So the highest life expectancy in the world is in Hong Kong, 84.9 years on average. Japan is just behind. And so East Asian countries do very well. European countries then mix in, I think Switzerland and Spain are in the top 5 as well. But you've also got some countries which are less economically powerful in the top in the top range in terms of life expectancy. So Chile and Costa Rica both have life expectancies over 80. Lebanon, which is a country which is often kind of associated with war and the hardship, but actually has a life expectancy of 79 years in 2019, which is actually higher than the USA. And there are other countries which have which are relatively low GDPs, which have life expectancy above 75. So Ecuador is one example, which has a life expectancy above 75. Algeria and the countries nearby, and Vietnam as well, all countries which have much lower incomes, much lower GDPs than Western Europe and North America, but actually have not much worse life expectancies. When I go to well-being, you'll see that the map changes a little bit, although not hugely. Here you'll notice that East Asia now is mostly yellow. So as you know, I think people have noted the lower average reported well-beings in East Asia. And so you can see that here. And the countries which have the highest well-being on this measure are basically Scandinavia, Finland, Denmark, Switzerland's in there as well, quite high. But again, countries in Latin America are doing quite well. And Costa Rica, of course, comes up again as a country which has a high life subjective well-being, higher than the USA and higher than many other countries in Europe as well. The lowest life satisfaction, ladder of life in 2019 was in Afghanistan, the score of 2.4 out of 10. That was in 2019, so before all that's been going on there in the last few months. And also worth noting is India, which has the fourth lowest subjective well-being in the world, or one of the countries we've got, which is obviously something to bear in mind, given it's the second largest country in the world in terms of population. Now, what happens when you then switch on to look at ecological footprint? Now, in simple terms, you can say, well, the graphs flip, the maps flip around. So the countries that were red are now green, and the countries that were green are now red. But it's not quite as simple as that. If you flick through, for example, between life expectancy and ecological footprint, I'm not quite sure how well this is appearing on your screen, so I won't do it too much. But if you do that, then you'll notice that 3 countries stay green on both those measures. Ecuador down here, which I mentioned earlier, Armenia and Sri Lanka, for example. So these are 3 countries which have a life expectancy above 75 and have an ecological footprint which is within environmental limits. So the ecological footprint, with the other 2 indicators, the colors are a little bit arbitrary. With ecological footprint, we've used the biocapacity limit to define green. So countries which are green are countries which have a footprint which is below that 1.56 threshold I mentioned earlier. So these are 3 countries which are achieving quite a high life expectancy, but within environmental limits. When you look at their well-being, though, actually, all those 3 countries are either yellow or, actually, in the case of Sri Lanka, red. So they don't achieve a green on all 3 indicators, which is kind of what we'd be interested in seeing. So what happens when you bring it all together for the Planet Index? So this is the graph, this is the map, which I obviously this is all very fresh. We just produced the website was developed just last week, and as I sat down to prepare the presentation on Monday, I suddenly realized it's very green because in previous Planet Indexes we've had the map has been much redder, and it's greener now partly because actually, as I'll show you with the trends data, Planet Index has gone up slightly in over globally, but it's also greener because the thresholds aren't the same. So don't look at this and think, oh, it's all green, we're doing well now. It's just that the thresholds aren't the same. So for example, if I look at the USA, it's got a Planet Index score of 37, and it's colored in yellow as if it's kind of okay, but well, I would say 37 should be red, but that's a design matter. Anyway, you'll see now that the story that has been told by the various indicators kind of comes out clearer here. So the countries, as you can see, that are doing best are in South America, Latin America in general, and then North America is not doing so well. I've already highlighted the USA there. Those who've seen the Planet Index before might notice that Europe is doing a lot better than before, and I'll talk about that later. So there's a lot of countries coming out actually in the top 20 in Europe. And while of course rankings are a little bit not very scientific, I will go to the rankings now. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Costa Rica is again the country which has topped the High Planet Index. Vanuatu, which is in the Pacific, Colombia, Switzerland, and Ecuador fill up the rest of the top 5. As I said, and you can click here to show other countries. As I said, unlike in previous editions, we're seeing more, well, not unlike, but we're seeing more European countries appearing in the top rankings than in previous editions. So the United Kingdom is in 14th place. I already mentioned Switzerland, 4th place. Netherlands is 18th. Other Western European countries aren't far behind. New Zealand is 11th place as well, which is worth noting. So I'll come on to why that's the case when I switch back to the presentation. Oh, actually, before I do that, as I've said before, there's no country which gets green on all 3 measures, and that's kind of one of the things that's interesting. I've looked at across all the 15 years for which we have data from 2006 to 2020. There is no point in time when any country gets all 3 green. There's a lot of countries that come close, but none achieve it. So I'll come back to the presentation now. Bear with me. Okay. So as I said, we're able to look at things over time, and this is basically because we've got the Gallup World Poll running over several years now. So it allows us to kind of have a harmonized data set using using the same measure over many years. And as I said, the EU, this is the pink line is the EU. They're showing that a lot of Western European countries, well, and Eastern European, obviously, in the EU, are seeing rising Happy Planet Index score. So it's an average of just under 45, gone up to just under 50 in 2019. The USA has also risen a little bit, that purple line there, but not quite as much, and obviously from a much lower starting point. The UK is doing very well, and that's and the same with Western Europe. When you look at that, that's basically down to declining ecological footprint, but also slightly rising subjective well-being. We've seen that in the UK national data, but also in the world poll. And then the other country, this is a few selected countries. The other country which I think is very interesting in terms of the trend is India. That's the sort of brighter green line there. In 2006, it had a high score, just over 50. But in 2019, it's gone down to 36.4. This is due to rapidly rising ecological footprint and rapidly falling subjective well-being. So that's a few selected countries. And then when you look at regions, the other thing, I mean, some of those obviously patterns are replicated in regions. So South Asia line has gone down considerably because of India. One other pattern which I think is interesting is that Africa, which had the lowest Happy Planet Index, average Happy Planet Index score in 2006, has also been steadily rising. So from about 32 to about 39 in 2019. And that's due to increasing life expectancy. In 2006, we were still coming out of the AIDS epidemic in many parts of Africa. So increasing life expectancy. Actually also, what's interesting is ecological footprint hasn't risen very much in Africa, and it's not risen in some countries. So they're able to achieve those better quality of life living conditions without increasing ecological footprint. Now, what about COVID? So I've taken you up there until 2019, but I haven't told you what's happened in 2020. And I think in 2021, you can't present any data on people's living conditions without talking about the impact of the pandemic. So the data which I present now, which I can present some data, has to be treated a little bit with caution. So for example, Wellbeing was only available for 95 countries, so not the 150 which we had for 2019. The data collection was not consistent, wasn't the same in all countries. So some countries, data collection actually did happen around in the first few months of 2020 before the pandemic really kicked in. Other countries, most of the data collection was in the spring when things were very critical in Europe. The average data collection time was somewhere in late summer, autumn 2020. So the time when, at least in Europe, things were doing better, but not actually in the whole world. I mean, the USA, I think, for example, was having quite a bad time in late summer 2020. So because of that, because different countries were having different sort of patterns in terms of what the pandemic was doing to them, and the data collection was not the timing of the data collection was not consistent across countries, one has to treat this data with caution. Life expectancy, surprisingly, takes quite a long time to collect that data. So we only have actual data for 2020 for 36 countries. Sort of perhaps unsurprisingly, mostly wealthy countries, but also some lower income countries. And so for the remaining countries, we estimated life expectancy based on two things: the previous trend, so the trend in previous years, and then a study which estimated drops in life expectancy attributable to the pandemic based on deaths and the age of people who died. So obviously, if people are dying when they're very old, then that has a lower impact on life expectancy than if people are dying when they're young. And then perhaps most difficult was the ecological footprint. We didn't have, well, as I said before, we didn't even have data for 2018 and 2019. That was already estimated. For 2020, we don't have carbon emissions data for every country. We had to wait for, sorry, I'll come back to that. We had to wait for data from the BP Statistical Review, which came out in June. And they have carbon emissions data for most countries, but not all. So we used that to try and work out the change in ecological footprint. And we also used an estimate calculated by the Global Footprint Network themselves, which estimated that ecological footprint fell by 6.5% between 2019 and 2020. So we combined those two things. So just bear that in mind. So you've got three indicators. You've got subjective well-being, you've got ecological footprint, and you've got life expectancy. What did the pandemic do? When you combine them all together, did it mean that the Planet Index went up or down? Now, this is going to be quite surprising, but actually makes sense when you think about it in detail. But in most regions, the Planet Index went up. The only region where it didn't go up was Latin America, which has had a particularly harsh experience of the pandemic. But overall, it went up. I would say that some of that data, for example, there's a big rise in South Asia, which seems to be driven by a rise in India, which I'm a little bit suspicious about. I'm not sure how reliable that data is. It's only 1 year's data. And remember that at the end of the day, South Asia, the data for that is just based on 1,000 people, basically, because India dominates that data set, and the sample is about 1,000 people in the Gallup World Poll. But overall, you can see that the Planet Index has gone up. If you look at selected countries, you can see, I already mentioned Latin America, it's fallen. Brazil is the main reason why the Planet Index has fallen in Latin America, but it did fall in other countries in Latin America. And whereas, so if I go back to the line for Western Europe, which you can see Western Europe rose in 2020 to be the highest scoring region. Whereas that's the case for Western Europe as a whole, the UK, it's flatlined. It's basically the Planet Index didn't increase in 2020. So a little bit of understanding. Remember, it's three components. How can we understand that? Well, firstly, let's look at ecological footprint. As I said, it fell by 6.5% globally. In wealthier countries, on average, it fell by 15%, based on our estimates. And this is countries, percentage of countries where it's risen and fallen or stayed the same. And you can see that in 2/3 of countries, ecological footprint fell a considerable amount, which is not surprising. Life expectancy obviously fell in lots of countries, but based on our estimates, it probably didn't fall in a lot of countries, particularly in Africa, where there was a general increasing trend, and the pandemic, at least according to official statistics, didn't seem to lead to many deaths. So you've still got actually quite a lot of countries, and in countries like China, which actually had very little deaths overall in 2020, life expectancy rose. So globally, there was a slight fall in life expectancy, but actually most of that was in Latin America and Western Europe, and many other countries it actually rose or stayed the same. Sorry, did someone say something? I've probably got 5 minutes, right? Okay, I'll hurry up. And then in terms of subjective well-being, the pattern is quite complicated. So in some countries it fell, and in some countries it rose. Now, this is a pattern that we've seen. I mean, there are going to be some anomalies in the Gallup World Poll data, which we can't look too much detail into single countries. But overall, this pattern of some countries rising, some countries falling, can be seen in the Eurobarometer data as well. Well-being rose in several countries in Europe in 2020. And we've seen it in some national statistics data sets. So I noticed that there was a survey, in Italy, there was Istat have produced data showing that well-being actually rose in many parts of the country in 2020 during the pandemic, even during the height of the pandemic. In Luxembourg, I think your own study showed that some people said that it was about 50-50 in terms of people saying that well-being improved versus people who said that their well-being deteriorated during the pandemic. So, which kind of, it's surprising when you think about it, but actually it does kind of make sense, because for most of us, the biggest impacts of the pandemic has not been, obviously, many of us will have know people who've been seriously ill. Some of us may have been seriously ill ourselves, but the majority of people have experienced a change in lifestyle. Basically, that's been the main impact. And that change in lifestyle has been a matter of slowing down, reduced consumption, probably reduced income in some cases, but also reduced consumption, probably spending more time with family. And those things are, there's a mix of outcomes there. Some of those things we know we can expect are going to lead to increased well-being. And so, as I say, when you bring it all together, the HPI tends to go up in most countries. So that's the results, and I'm sure there'll be some lively discussion about that. I just want to quickly say a couple of words about what the implications are for national statistics offices. And should you have a happy Luxembourg index? Is that what I'm going to recommend now? No, I'm not. That's not the implication of the Planet Index. As I said, the main audience for us initially was to make people rethink what they think is progress, and not necessarily to change data collection. But there are some things that we'd want that I think are some lessons we can learn. And I just want to sort of obviously recognize and give full credit to the work that Static are already doing. I believe you've done 2 reports already with the PE Bien-être report. Translating into English is quite tricky, saying it in English. But anyway, as I understand it, you've got a set of about 63 indicators across 11 domains. And you also produce an index which brings those indicators together where possible, the LIW. Sorry, what does the L stand for?
Luxembourg, no surprise.
Okay, Luxembourg Index of Wellbeing, sorry. So the Luxembourg Index of Wellbeing, and you've combined this together and shown that while GDP has increased, for example, over this time period, well-being in Luxembourg has fallen. Then it's lower than it was in 2009. So what would I suggest could be, what progress can be made, or sort of what would I recommend are the next steps for Luxembourg based on our work on the Happy Planet Index? I think the main message, I think there's two main messages. I think the main message is to distinguish between means, ends, and resources. And that's always been sort of what's been at the heart of the Happy Planet Index, the sense that there are lots of things which are important to measure, but they aren't, but they're the means to a goal. That increasing the economy size is not important in its own right. To be honest, perhaps I would say that, sort of having good governance structures or getting people to vote is not important in its own right. It's achieving a goal. And we've defined that goal in terms of high well-being and high life expectancy. I think other people might define those goals differently, but there's a job to distinguish between means and ends. In 2011, we produced a report which I think was a bit more targeted at national statistics offices, which I encourage you to read, called Measuring Our Progress. And we proposed this framework for understanding progress, where you have your goals, you have your resources in terms of resource consumption, and you've got these human systems, the means, I guess. And the Happy Planet Index we suggested was one indicator within that framework, which you could use. It's the indicator which links the goals to the resources. You can also have indicators like carbon efficiency, which link resources to human systems, to the economy in this case. And we also talked about the idea of a plenty line, sort of how much income do you need to achieve high well-being within a country, as another valuable measure. But the important thing is that distinction: goals, human systems, resources. And I would say that that distinction has not been made in many statistics offices, and I imagine it's hard because defining goals is a political process. But for example, when I look at the domains that you've got, for me, I look at that and I see, based on the Planet Index, health and subjective well-being, I would say, are goals. There are measures of the resource use in the environment, and the rest are means. Yeah, and they're all important. So it's not to say they shouldn't be measured, but is there any way of structuring that set of domains so that it's clear what are the goals and which are the means and what are the resources? And that's important because then when you combine them into an index, you've got some sense, you've got a way of understanding the weightings, and you've also got a way of understanding sort of what that means. So with Happy Planet Index, we've created an efficiency index, how much well-being per unit of resources. I guess there are other ways of doing it, but that's the way we've done it for ourselves. And the other thing which I think is a challenge, and it's a challenge for all sets of indicators, is this issue of standardization. And I think it's one that everyone has to grapple with, and I think you've done a good job, and certainly better than some other initiatives I've seen. But there are still problems, and I think I'd like to just sort of illustrate this with one example. This is like, I've looked at the data for life satisfaction, which you've got in your data set. And so you can, and I'm actually using data from the UK here because I had it to hand. So your approach to standardization is to take basically T0, so the first year, and look at the change from T0 for each year, and that's the score. That gives you your change over time, and that's very useful. It gives you a change over time. It allows you to track progress, which is important for countries. It's more important perhaps than comparing between countries. But how that percentage change calculates, what that percentage change is, very much depends on what the original indicators are. So with life satisfaction, you could look at the average life satisfaction, which you do, and you would see that in the UK, this is what happens. You get a rise and then a fall, about 4%, I think, in the highest. But other people would say, well, let's not use mean as life satisfaction. Let's look at the percentage of people who score 6 to 10, kind of a high score. And if you do that and you look at the percentage change, it's much lower, just 2% increase. Just because percentage who are scoring 6 to 10 is about 90%. So when it increases to 95%, it's a small increase. The other thing you could do, which is what the UK does, is say, well, let's actually look at the percentage of people who score very high, 9 or 10 on life satisfaction. And if you did that and then you looked at percentage change, you'd get huge changes. And so just sort of how you operationalize the indicators has a big difference on what percentage the percentage changes are. And so and they're not meaningful differences. Obviously, it's not really meaningful to say that. I mean, how do you argue which of these is the correct way to say what's the percentage change in well-being? And obviously, if some indicators are measured with averages and some are measured with percentages and some are measured with GDP, then that's likely to lead to problems. So that's something which I think all attempts to combine indicators need to bear in mind and think about. The other two things I would say, which I think is nothing surprising, is timeliness, and I'm sure you're all talking to those who hold the budgets in Static, asking for better timeliness on data. For example, you have wellbeing data up to 2019, which is not bad. Other countries, I'm sure, have even less timely data. But especially in terms of wellbeing, and especially when you think about the pandemic and how it's changed, we need more rapid and regular data. When you look at something like Ecological Footprint, as I said, we're using data for 2017, which is pretty useless when you think about everything that's changed since then. So timeliness is a key issue. And then another thing I would say is the Hash Planet Index, but also wellbeing, and I think I'm probably echoing things that you guys say is we know a lot about what determines subjective wellbeing, so we need to spend more resources on measuring the drivers, so social relationships, and also the drivers of things which are relevant to wellbeing and environmental resource use, so social relationships, active transport, healthy eating, just some examples. And then the last thing is working with government bodies. Obviously, I know that a lot of the work you need to do needs to be sort of tied in with government bodies. And another key factor is how can we, which we've seen in other countries, for example, the UK and New Zealand, is working with treasuries, ministries of finance, I think in Italy as well, to try and predict what are the impacts of policies on on well-being and the other indicators. And so you need good modelling for that. I hope my daughter doesn't mind that I've used a picture of her, nor her niece, but I couldn't find a picture of a model. So those are the kind of key messages I would like to give. I said I'd only talk for half an hour, and I've talked for much longer, sorry. But I will leave it at that. So thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and comments.
That was great, Saamah. So especially the stuff that was specifically tailored for our offices, quite relevant. So thank you for that added part. And we can open it up to questions. And so feel free to post in the chat or raise your hand. Sometimes I have to admit I've missed hand raises in the past, so the chat might be the most efficient, but feel free to raise your hand as well, and we'll definitely get to you. And while we wait for questions to come in, I think maybe what I'll do is start us off. And I like your point, especially about our dashboard, the difference between means and goals. And I wonder to what extent, this is also a subjective, and you can think about other things that are means, other things that are goals, and, other things that could go into the denominator. So to what extent do you think health, for example, is already captured in people's subjective well-being? Also, people's concern for the environment. But there's another area, maybe we don't capture health adequately in subjective well-being, maybe we don't capture the environment well. People aren't paying enough attention to that when evaluating their lives. But what about also social equity issues? So income inequality, but gender rights, maybe ethnic issues within a country. So maybe we've got some things in here and maybe we're missing some others. That's it, thanks.
Sorry, not able to unmute. Great question, thank you. So that's a lot of things you suggested you brought in there. I would say that obviously, so one of the biggest predictors of subjective well-being is health, subjective health. So you could argue, well, health is already in there. I would say that there is an element. We use this idea of happy life years in the sense that someone who lives happily for 50 years, but then dies when they're 50. That's, you would argue, in terms of sort of outcomes, that's worse than someone who lives as happy but lives for 70 years. So I think all else being equal, a longer life expectancy is a positive thing, I guess, to an extent anyway. So that's why we will include life expectancy in there. In terms of equality, in terms of environment, I would say that people don't on average consider the environment when they're evaluating their subjective well-being. I think that we would all, I think we people, particularly those of us who know about what's going on the planet and climate change, would be all very miserable if we were able to fully sort of capture that, but we're just not able to do that. In terms of equality, so in the last Happy Planet Index, we did an inequality adjustment. So we had data, we were able to inequality adjust the well-being and the health outcomes. But we haven't been able to do that because we didn't have distribution data on well-being this time. So that's why we weren't able to do that. I would say that would be the ideal. I would also think it'd be great to be able to split it by demographic groups. So to be able to sort of look at Happy Planet Index people of different ethnic minorities within a country, for example, and gender and income groups. We haven't gotten that far, but that would be definitely something that would be great to be able to do. But the last thing I'd say is that income inequality, one of the things that we have seen when you look at data across countries, that income inequality does seem to be associated with subjective well-being. So countries with higher income inequality do have lower subjective well-being. And places with higher income inequality. So I would hope that some element of income inequality is captured in there.
Great, thanks. And we have a question from Andrew.
Yeah, hi, Saamah. It's nice to sort of see you actually again. I'm assuming that everyone can hear me. I don't know, actually, because
the volume is pretty low, Andrew, but we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, let me yell into my screen. I hope you can hear that. I've got no idea how to do WebEx. It's most mysterious. The two things that occurred to me, Saamah, I hope you can hear these clearly enough, is if we're counting the number of happy years and then dividing it by some ecological use, doesn't that mechanically mean bigger countries are happier? And this is a pro-immigration argument. I can't quite see how that's standardized. It sounds as though we would want to have immigrants even if they are absolutely miserable, because they would add some more happy life years. And the second issue is time. I'm not surprised that the index went up during COVID because we reduced ecological use. And and essentially supported consumption through borrowing. So that's, of course, that was probably a good thing, but it's not a sustainable model in the longer run, as we're all figuring out now. So I hope you could hear those. If not, I can write them in the chat.
No, I can hear very well. Thank you, Andrew. And yes, I don't think the lesson from the Planet Index is we need more global pandemics. That's not what we're saying here. And I think that when you look at the long, yeah, I'm not able to speak about the long. I noticed that the Eurobarometer data for 2021, for early 2021, so February, March, there was indeed a fall in well-being in most European countries. Even if we were able to somehow, even if we were resilient to the pandemic in terms of well-being in 2020, that was not necessarily the case in 2021. But I would say that, you know, the fall, I mean, we did sustain our consumption, but we certainly, through borrowing, but we you know, we did a lot less unnecessary consumption. So we sustained our sort of the consumption we need, but we certainly all traveled a lot less. And we probably bought, well, I think a lot of people bought things for their houses because they were going to spend a lot of time in their houses. But I think that sort of our general consumption was lower because, you know, because of the sort of uncertainty, I think. In terms of your first point about sort of bigger countries, no, because we're doing it all per capita, right? So, I mean, it's average well-being, it's average life expectancy. So that's in effect per capita, and we're dividing it by ecological.
Oh, that's great. I missed that because I was farting around with WebEx at the beginning.
Sorry.
But you don't have borrowing anywhere, do you?
No. But okay, can I just say something? Yeah, but I do want to say something else about that per capita thing. So it's interesting. So Switzerland, so when we spoke to experts in Switzerland, they were quite surprised by Switzerland doing so well and rising steadily over the years. And when we looked at it, and they were like, no, but our ecological footprint hasn't been going down. So their CO2 emissions haven't been going down very much, but their population has risen. So probably through immigration. And so, but, you know, it is per capita. So I think that, you know, it should be fine.
But that has the unpleasant implication that we should kill off unhappy people.
Yeah, I wouldn't take indicators too far in terms of policy conclusions.
I'm not proposing that either, but whatever way you do this, it's kind of dodgy at some level. But anyway, I think this is a great piece of work you're doing, and thanks for that. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you both. We have a question from Christos who has to leave quickly, so hopefully we can.
My main question is about, you know, whether, first of all, I appreciate very much that you collect all this data, that we can actually see this more global picture. I would stick mostly, you know, to the ecological. What I want to ask is the following. The data you collect, would you be able to track part of that data, not the happy index necessarily, the Happy Planet Index, but just part of it? Would you be able to track, you know, the progress towards sustainability goals? How good are they when it comes to policy analysis? Second question, this is a bit more academic. I was wondering, of course, you have the data and somebody can do a lot with that, whether the construction of the Happy Planet Index has been based on some kind of axioms, you know, of index, you know, theory. And the reason I ask, of course, is because perhaps, you know, the index itself might evolve in order to give a more, you know, robust picture of the comparisons, you know, across space and time. These are the two questions, essentially. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, so in terms of sort of tracking progress towards SDGs, well, yeah, it's tricky because obviously the indicators we measure are not the SDGs. I'm just sort of quickly going back to the graphs for trends over time. But actually, I'll stick to 2019 because that's the more reliable data. But I would say that, I mean, one of the things which when you look at this, you can do it, I think, on the website. I haven't done it here. Is you can look at, you can kind of set targets based on sort of living within biocapacity and maintaining sort of a high level of life expectancy and subjective well-being, or in countries which have low levels, kind of reaching those sort of those green colors. And you can look at targets and you can look at see how far we need to change. And generally, you know, there's a general pattern of slight increases, but not nearly fast enough. And I think this is kind of a lesson we'll see, as we go into COP now into COP26, I think, a lot of people are saying, okay, we've made progress, but it's nowhere near as fast as what we need to achieve to avoid, sort of quite catastrophic climate change. And this reinforces that point. I think what we would like to do with the Planet Index is to remind ourselves not to be so pessimistic, because we have been able to make changes, and to highlight the fact that even when we have had to reduce consumption, and I think this is a lesson from the pandemic, even when we have had to reduce consumption, and granted what Andrew said, there may well be, it may well be that there are issues of sustainability here, but I do think that there's a lesson which seems intuitive, that yes, we have been able to, in Western countries, reduce our consumption, certainly reduce our travel, reduce our time and reduce our working time in some cases, spend more time with family, and that has not led to a collapse in our society. It's not led to a collapse in well-being. In fact, in some cases, it's led to increasing well-being. And so that suggests that there is a way to do this for environmental reasons as well. In terms of your more technical question, when we developed this in 2006, I wouldn't say that we had particular sort of guides. We didn't use any particular guidelines on how to create an indicator. Since then, obviously, I've worked on lots of different kind of indices and indicators, and I would say that there probably are some improvements that could be made to the index. But we've tried to keep things simple for the purposes of this. I think if a government said, we really want to measure Planet Index, can we do it properly? I would probably say, well, do you really want to do it? Because actually you also want to be able to measure the different components. If they said, yes, we really want this headline indicator, and we want this sort of single figure which we can use to replace GDP, then I would want to sit down and look in detail at how the trade-offs work out between the top and the bottom. So basically, and I think this would need to be guided by some kind of sort of expertise on environmental indicators, but also needs to be guided by some kind of democratic process. Because yes, we've basically said that, I don't know exactly how it is, but we've basically said, for example, that you can trade off if someone lives 70 years and have a life expectancy, if someone has a life expectancy of 70 and a well-being of 6, then you could swap this for a life expectancy of 60 and a well-being of 7. We've just kind of basically said that. Is that a fair assumption? Is that how people really would trade off well-being and life expectancy? That's something you could actually find out. And similarly, you could look at sort of the trade-off between well-being and environmental outcomes and try and find a way to do this in a fair way, and a way that sort of reflects what our society wishes. So I think you do need to do that process a bit more detailed if you were really going to take it into policy. For the purposes of a communication tool, we're happy with it as it is.
He responded, thanks, in the chat, and said, unfortunately, he has to leave. And then Francesco has his hand raised as well. So you can go next.
Hi, thank you. Thanks a lot, Saamah. Terrific presentation. I really enjoyed your talk, and I really appreciate the time and thought you put into considering our PBNet, and you made very good points about strengths and weaknesses of our tool. In particular, I think I will look deeper into the framework you proposed of distinguishing means and the resources. That could help us, rationalizing a little bit our dashboard, and perhaps also improving on the communication and timeliness of the tool. However, I say I need to look deeper into it because the distinction between means and the resources is not entirely obvious to me. But let me reciprocate by actually asking a question about the Happy Planet Index, because you said you multiply, life expectancy by well-being, dividing over ecological footprint, and then I wonder, have you considered introducing some correction for dispersion of well-being? So rather than the average of the ladder, you might consider how dispersed well-being is in a country. And the same you could do for life expectancy to include a little bit the health dimension into your accounting. You could have actually healthy life expectancy. And then very shortly back to the PBNet, do you have any ideas how we could improve on timeliness? That is really our big problem at present.
I think
thank you in advance.
Yeah. The last question, in a way, the answer is the easiest. I mean, I guess you just need more money, right? I don't really know how to, I mean, I'm wary. I mean, it's good when sometimes people do nowcasting to kind of estimate sort of data when they're not able to collect it right away. But ultimately, it's not. So we've in effect done nowcasting for a lot of the indicators here because we didn't have life expectancy data, so we estimated it based on the data that was available. But ultimately, you know, you want to see the real data to be able to be sure about things. So you know, subjective with the well-being surveys, I think that things can definitely go a lot quicker. The UK now, for example, has and it's particularly done that during the course of the pandemic. They're focused on this. There is the sort of the main survey, the big survey, which is the annual population survey, which is the big sample, which I guess forms the kind of the most robust data. But they also have this opinion survey, which they during the pandemic actually did it every week, and they did it every week, and then they reported the data within a couple of weeks. And it's possible, of course, it's possible. You just need to, you know, just put the resources into collecting the data and processing the data, and you know, also perhaps you need to probably in that case reduce the requirements in terms of sort of data quality checks and stuff. So the idea is, you know, you can produce data quick and fast. There may be some costs in terms of data quality, but I think it's a valuable thing to do. And in terms of, you said that sort of you find the distinction between means and resources is tricky. Yes, maybe you're right, but I think the most important thing is with indicator sets to understand, more the difference between means and ends. And it may well be that the environmental ends can be framed in terms of ends as well. So, for example, increasing renewable energy. The percentage of energy that comes from renewable sources is not an end. It's not a goal. It's that's a way to achieve it. What you really want to do is reduce CO2 emissions. What we really want to do is reduce, stop climate change. But I don't think there's any way of doing that without reducing CO2 emissions. So you can do those kind of links. And one of the things that I've done when I was working at New Economics Foundation, when we've done workshops with people with the well-being side of things, is to think about sort of things which are important to them and then kind of map them out in terms of sort of why are they important to them. So, you can do this with young people at school. Why do you want to get good grades? I want to get good grades because I want this job. Why do you want this job? Because I want to be able to travel or whatever. I don't know. So you can that sort of means and ends things can be done quite easily for both the sort of the more well-being side of things and the environmental thing. And then you just lastly, you also mentioned dispersion. So as I said, maybe I didn't say it very clearly. We did in the previous Happy Planet Index do an inequality, which is basically dispersion adjusted Happy Planet Index. We weren't able to do that this time because we didn't have the distributional data for well-being. So yeah, I mean, I think that's something that's worth doing. So thanks for the questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, you also mentioned healthy life years. Yeah, I'm a bit wary about adjusting for healthy life years as well as adjusting for happiness, because I think that the healthy life years measure uses subjective measures as well. So then I think we'd be double counting the subjective side of things. But yeah.
Thank you.
Good, and I see Loomer, if I'm pronouncing your name right, you have your camera on and off mic, so if you want, you can, oh, I see you have a question here. Yeah, great. So if you want, you can ask your question for us.
Perhaps I can explain it. As I understood, the formula was that you multiply life expectancy with life satisfaction, and then you divide this by the ecological footprint. And so I was asking, this, I think, is some sort of efficiency, ecological efficiency. So how much well-being is produced with this kind of, or with this magnitude of ecological investment. And so if you have it more, then of course it's better, and so on. But the question is, if that's the question, if you want to really have that, the ecological efficiency or something different, you could also measure something like the well-being within humanity on the one hand, and then subtract from this the destruction we do on the planet. And so this would be something like subtracting the ecological footprint. Of course, you could then weigh that with some figure, and that would be, let's say, something which would be something neutral between, let's say, the human well-being and the nature's well-being, something like that. Yes, and you should try to sum that up. And that was the question. So how would that be an alternative for you? Would that be something you intended?
So it's kind of like a balance sheet, isn't it? Sort of, we produce this much human well-being, but we are creating this much future human well-being reduction with our ecological damage. I think,
or even the world in itself, nature in itself, something like that. If it has an intrinsic value, yeah, it could be also that.
Yeah, I think the challenge, I mean, from a mathematical sense, the challenge is how do you what units is this ultimately based on? So the Happy Planet Index has a unit. It's basically sort of it's years divided by global hectares, and the well-being is an adjustment on the years. So it has a unit, although we never talk about it like that, but it has a unit. If you were to subtract the footprint from the sort of, technically speaking, it's tricky to subtract something which is measured in a different unit to something else. So you kind of need the same units for that if you want to subtract. You could do that, perhaps. Maybe you could convert ecological footprint to somehow years of life lost, if we talk about human life. I think, yeah, other forms of life would be tricky, but you could somehow sort of make an estimation of how many years of life are lost because of CO2 emissions, and subtract that from the years that we have now. I think you're going to have to make some quite heroic assumptions and calculations. I think it'll be hard to do, but but it's a theoretical possibility.
I have a different suggestion for you. You can interpret this also as evaluations. So the multiplication could be, let's say, transformed proportionally into a value measure. So it would be 1-to-1. And then you have the ecological footprint, and then you have to measure it. How much is that? How does that value for you? So you can take a different factor here and multiply, let's say, with 2, 3, or something like else. And what it is expressed in this sense, in this way, is its value. It's not the ecological footprint any longer. It's the value of the ecological footprint. And then you can, of course, make the addition.
Okay. It sounds, yeah, I'd be very interested. I'd be very interested to see what comes out of doing that. So if you like, well, the data, you can download the components. You'd be very welcome to experiment with it and do something different. So.
With that, Saamah, unless you have any closing remarks for us, I think we've gone a little bit over time. So actually, thank you for staying with us, and all of the audience members as well. We've gone past time now. So Saamah, anything you want to say?
No, I mean, I just want to say that this is please do share the Happy Planet Index if you found it interesting, and spread the message that spread the message the HPI makes. Connect with Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So I didn't say that I don't work for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, but we've worked with them to create the Happy Planet Index, and they're doing lots of great things, bringing people together to work towards a wellbeing economy. So have a look at their website and get involved. I'll put the link up now. But yes, thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you, Saamah.
Okay.
Great, thanks, Saamah. So just a last message for everybody who's still there. We have 2 more speakers scheduled for the remainder of the year. And we will put Julia Slater and Anke Plagnall, we will put up this video probably in the next few days or next week on the website. and hope to see you at the next event. Thank you very much.